Unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably heard what we are talking about today. And it's incredible how quickly things can change. A few months ago, I committed what now feels like a cardinal sin. I wished the rain would stop. And now, every second article and video and reel I watch is basically telling me, you are going to regret this. Yes, we are talking about the 2026-2027 possible El Nino. Now, every video I've watched seems to fall into one of two categories. Either it sounds like the end of the world, or you need a meteorology degree just to understand what they are trying to explain. But the strange thing is, especially here in South Africa, is that many farmers have just come through an extremely wet season. I was in the Free State a few weeks ago, and I spoke to farmers who still had their crops standing, because the grain had not dried enough down to harvest properly. So on one side, you have farmers dealing with crops that are still too wet, and almost in the same breath, you have everyone who's talking about El Nino and the threat of a hotter, drier season ahead. Imagine that. El Nino comes and goes in cycles, and we'll get to what that means later. But this is not going to be a complicated science lecture. I want to have a look at what it could actually mean to us closer to home, what it means for South Africans, for farmers, for food prices, and yes, eventually for biltong. I'm Rian from DJ's Biltong, and in this series we discuss South African meat stories, history, culture, and honestly, anything that we find interesting. Today's topic is the end of the world. No, I'm joking. We are talking about El Nino, and South Africa have survived El Ninos before. Now, I know some of you might be wondering, why is a Biltong channel covering a weather event? Well, firstly, because I can. But also, there's actual relevance here. Contrary to what some of our politicians seem to believe, products do not just magically spawn on the shelves. Food starts on a farm, and farms rely heavily on what the weather is doing. So when things go wrong on a farm, the effects can move through the whole supply chain. Farmers, feed, cattle, transport, meat prices, and yes, eventually biltong shops. Droughts linked to El Nino can have devastating effects. My grandpa lost his farm during the 1982-83 El Nino drought, so I'm not going to pretend this topic means nothing. But I also do not think we need to hit the panic button just yet. We've come through a very wet season. In many parts of the countries, dam levels in some major systems are healthy, and soil moisture is better than it would be after a dry season. So, we are not starting from nothing. And that is what makes this topic strange to me personally. A few months ago, the problem for many farmers was too much rain. Now, the conversation suddenly is about a possible drought. Let's look at what El Nino actually is. But fair warning, I'm not a climate scientist. I do not spend all day every day researching climate so that I can lecture people in the comment sections of weather videos about how the world is doomed. And I'm also not here to try to put you to sleep, trying to pronounce words I don't even fully understand in my second language. So this is going to be a very simplified version in very plain terms. From my understanding, El Nino happens when normal trade winds over the Pacific or the tropical Pacific weaken. Those winds usually push warm surface water to the western Pacific, near places like Australia and Indonesia. But when those winds weaken, that warm water can shift back towards central and eastern Pacific, closer to South America. So this causes the ocean to warm in places that it's not usually as warm. And because the ocean and atmosphere is connected, that can disturb weather patterns across the world. That is why El Nino does not affect every place in the same way. So while South African or Southern African countries often worry about hotter, drier summer conditions, other parts of the world can get wetter conditions, flooding, or completely different effects. Some areas may not feel any change at all. And I know this has nothing to do with biltong, but coffee is a good example. Some major coffee growing regions can be affected by unusual rainfall or heat during El Nino periods, which is the reason why sometimes you'll hear people start talking about coffee when these weather patterns appear. The point is, El Nino does not automatically mean drought everywhere, but for Southern Africa, especially during our summer rainfall season, The concern is that it can tilt the odds towards hotter, drier conditions and less reliable rainfall. And that's the key phrase here, tilt the odds. It does not guarantee a drought. It does not mean the whole country gets no rain at all. It does not mean every province will be affected the same way. And it does not mean that El Niño will definitely be as strong as 1982-83, 97-98, or 2015-2016 El Niño seasons. And it definitely does not mean food prices go up tomorrow. So maybe we do not need to go full panic stations just yet. El Niño is not the promise of bad times that every video or article is trying to clickbait you into watching. There is no guaranteed outcome. It changes the odds. The odds are higher that we could have a hotter summer. It's higher that we could have less rainfall and become less reliable. The odds are higher that certain parts of South Africa could feel more pressure than others. And that's why people take it seriously. Not because the world is ending tomorrow, but weather does not stay outside. It follows us into our homes, our water use, our electricity demand, our food prices, our farms, our shops, and eventually into things like Biltong. So yes, farmers are part of the story because they often feel the weather pressure first. But this is not only a farmer issue. You do not need to own a farm to be affected by farm weather. If crops, grazing, water, heat, imports, electricity demand, food supply come under pressure, ordinary South Africans can feel it in everyday life. So now the real question is, if the odds lands, where will ordinary South Africans feel it first? Usually, when we start hearing drought warnings, you would expect that we are coming off a few dry seasons already. You'd expect dam levels to be low, the grass to be struggling, and everyone already feeling the things drying out. But this time, it feels strange, because many parts of South Africa has just come through a very wet season. In fact, some of my friends and family have complained that it feels like we've not really had a proper summer in a couple of years. And I'm sure, depending on where you live, some of you probably feel the same way. Earlier I said I committed a cardinal sin by wishing the rain away. And I say that because I grew up around farming after the 1997 El Niño and the years of recovery that followed. Rain almost took on a sacred status. So wishing rain away is a big no-no. But here's the part people sometimes miss. Too much rain or rain at the wrong time can also cause serious problems. The rainy season before the one we just had, some farmers were losing crops because of flooding. And this year, because the rain came late and carried on so long, some farmers have struggled to harvest on time. Now, if you're not a farmer or a Clarkson's Farm fan, that might sound confusing. So let me explain. With crops like maize, it's not as simple as looking at a field and saying, well, it's standing there, just harvest it. The grain needs to dry down to a certain moisture level, so it can be stored safely. If it's harvested too wet, you can run into storage problems, quality problems, or you may have to pay extra drying costs to get the moisture down. So the crop can be ready in one sense, but still too wet in another sense. When we were driving through Free State and I saw fields and fields of maize standing halfway through the winter, I was surprised. I knew we had a wet season, but it was still eye-opening speaking to farmers and hearing the grain had not dried down enough to harvest properly. And that's the weird part. On paper, this year's maize harvest is expected to be one of the biggest South Africa has ever had. Some reports are reporting around 17 million tons, a possible record. But in reality, a big crop does not automatically mean an easy harvest. The late start to the season and the rain carrying on longer than usual delayed harvesting. And when farmers cannot harvest at the right time, that can still lead to losses, extra costs, and more pressure. So we're in a strange position where the last problem for many farmers was too much moisture. But farmers are always looking to the next season ahead. And now the warning for the next season is the complete opposite. Possibly hotter, drier conditions linked to the El Niño. But then again, what is that joke about the weatherman being wrong half the time and still keeping his job? I guess we'll have to wait and see. Unfortunately for farmers, they rely on predictions. They cannot wait for the weather to be here before reacting. So, what would El Niño actually look like for ordinary South Africans if it happens as predicted? What do we have to look forward to? Firstly, get those beach bodies ready, because if the forecasts are right, we could be heading into a very hot summer. The University of Pretoria's July seasonal forecast says above normal maximum temperatures are likely across much of southern Africa, and by early summer, below normal rainfall becomes the main forecast signal over much of the summer rainfall region. So, for ordinary people, the first thing most of us will probably notice is the heat. I do not know about the rest of you, but I struggle to sleep when it's hot. In my house, it becomes a constant battle with my wife about whether the fan should be on, where it should be blowing, and how strong it should blow. Because I want all of it, and she wants none of it. But heat is not just uncomfortable. Your fridges and freezers work harder. Those lucky enough to have aircon will probably use it more. Businesses with cold rooms, fridges, and freezers will feel it as well. And for food businesses, heat is just not irritating. It can mean spoilage. Spoilage happens quicker if the right steps are not taken. Heat makes everything work harder. Your fridge, your aircon, your body, and sometimes even your patience. Then we have water. Even after two relatively wet seasons, and even with many major dam systems currently at healthy levels, South Africa is still a water-scarce country. The Department of Water and Sanitation recently said major reservoirs were in healthy position, but also reminded people that water still has to be used carefully. So, a wet season gives us a better starting point, but it does not give us a free pass for the whole summer. Hotter conditions mean more evaporation from dams, soils, and gardens. If rainfall becomes less predictable or reliable, pressure can build. That does not mean the water restrictions are guaranteed. It does not mean we should be stupid with water just because the dams look good after the winter. And yes, I know it sucks when your garden is not in top shape, but we all share the water, so be responsible. If you collect rainwater, great. If you do not, maybe do not wait until restrictions are announced before you start thinking about how much water you are using. Then we get to the food prices. This is where people who are not farmers can still feel the farm weather. You might not have your own maize field, but you buy mielie meal. You might not raise cattle, but you buy meat. You might not grow vegetables, but somehow the till slip still finds you. If crops come under pressure, if yields are lower, if irrigation becomes more expensive, if feed costs rise, those pressures can move through the supply chain. It's basic supply and demand. If supply drops and demand stays, the same price can move up. And for us at the store, meat is obviously the one we watch closely. If feed prices go up for farmers or grazing conditions become difficult, that can eventually put pressure on livestock and meat prices. And because the meat supply chain is already under pressure from other issues, a dry season could add another layer. That does not mean biltong prices go up tomorrow. It means this is the kind of thing food businesses watch before customers feel it directly. But we also need to be fair. South Africa is not one climate zone. Cape Town has wet winters. Here on the Highveld, we rely more on summer rain. Some regions may be hit harder than others. Some may still get decent rain. And not every forecast plays out exactly the way people expect. So, El Niño does not mean no rainfall across the entire country. It does not mean every province is affected in the same way. And it does not mean we should all run around like the world is ending. We've had El Niños before. The 2015-2016 El Niño was a major one, and honestly, when I think back, I do not personally remember the period. I remember certain other droughts spoken about in farming communities. And I think a part of the reason this one feels so big is because we live in an era where clicks make the world go round. I mean, here I am discussing it, also hoping to get some clicks, so I can't act too innocent. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you the world is ending just to get a couple of engagement. The honest version is this. Some things might change. Some places might feel it harder than others. And weather will do what weather always does. Remind us we are not in full control. How much it affects ordinary South Africans will depend on how strongly the heat and rainfall pattern plays out, how farmers and water systems can handle it, and how much pressure moves through the food, electricity, water, and household costs. So, farmers are part of the story because they often feel the weather pressure early. But this is not only about farms. This is about how weather outside eventually follow the rest of us inside. If we're not going full panic stations, but we're also not ignoring it, what should we actually watch for? Well, firstly, do not just look at the headlines. Let's be honest, a lot of journalism these days survives on clicks, and fear gets clicks. Do your own research, go outside, talk to people, observe what's happening around you. Maybe don't talk to your chronically online friend who thinks the world is ending every second Tuesday, but people who are actually living and working through it. The first thing I would watch is the rainfall pattern. With just a little bit of research, you can find the average rainfall for your area. For example, here in Gauteng, our average rainfall normally follows a fairly predictable pattern. Once you know what normal looks like, you can start spotting when a season is actually behaving differently. The next thing I would watch is the heat. Heat waves tells you a lot. Hot weather means faster evaporation from dams, rivers, and the soil. It also puts more pressure on crops, grazing, and livestock. Just like you make sure your pets have enough water during a heat wave, farmers are thinking the exact same thing, just on a much, much bigger scale. Then, keep an eye on dam levels. Dam levels tell a bigger story than simply whether it rained in your town. It might not rain where you live, but if it rains upstream, that water eventually makes it into a dam. That is why dam levels are such a useful indicator. They give you an idea whether the broader water system is improving or coming under pressure. Remember though, healthy dam levels today does not guarantee healthy dam levels in 6 months from now. If you spend the time around farmers, listen to what they are talking about. Now, granted, farmers have earned themselves a reputation of enjoying a good complaint. But when you start hearing the same conversation from different farmers about struggling crops, poor grazing, rising feed costs, or increasing water pressure, pay attention. Those conversations often become tomorrow's headline. And finally, watch food prices. Mealie meal, meat, vegetables, basically anything that starts on a farm. Prices usually do not explode overnight. They tend to move slowly. If you've been paying attention recently, you would have probably noticed meat prices creeping up again. If you're not paying attention, the supermarket is not exactly going to put up a giant sign saying, "Attention shoppers, meat is now 30 Rand per kilogram more expensive." You simply notice that your grocery bill keeps getting a little bit more expensive. This should not cause panic. It should simply help you understand what is happening around you so that you can make better decisions. Forecasts change. South Africa is not one climate zone. A lot depends on when the rain arrives, how long the heat lasts, how farmers adapt, how our water systems cope, and even what happens in global markets. That is exactly why we need to pay attention, not because a disaster is guaranteed, but because being informed beats being surprised. I think I'm going to end this with a quote I came across a while ago by the Roman philosopher Seneca, written over 2,000 years ago. The quote goes, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." It kept coming back to me while I was researching El Niño. We live in a time where often we let other people fill our imaginations for us. Every headline has to be bigger than the last. Every thumbnail says the world is ending. And before long, we can end up suffering more from what we imagine might happen than from what actually is happening in reality. So, just pay attention, stay informed, prepare if necessary, but don't let the headlines and videos convince you the world is ending before it actually gives you a reason to think so. If you enjoyed today's video, or at the very least, found it understandable, I'd really appreciate it if you left us a like, subscribe to the channel, or if you're watching on Facebook, give the page a follow. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.